ultimately died. Okay. Okay. The marriage ultimately dies like the fields of wheat around them, and Elsa has to make a decision for herself and her children, her daughter Lareda, her son Anthony. I'm sorry. Excuse me. Okay. She's got to make this big decision, which, by the way, so many farmers had to make at that time, whether to go ahead and move west, to go to California. And it was an agonizing choice, whether to stay and fight for the land she loves or leave it behind and go west to California in search of what she hopes is going to be a better life. And of course, what we know from reading the book is she gets to California and we see what she is up against, and a better life is not really what she finds. And so what we see is that the book is the story of America and adversity. We see that search for the American dream. And what it powerfully depicts is the courage and the sacrifice that has come to define that whole generation, the greatest generation. So I want to begin by asking you a question. And that is, number one, did you like the book? And if so, what adjectives would you use to describe this story? What did you think about the book? Did you enjoy it? Did you like it? Feel free to use the chat. Go ahead and jump in on the microphone. That works.
I loved it. I loved the book. I felt it was extremely compelling.
Yep, I agree with you, Judy. I really do. Who else? Anyone else have anything to say? So compelling, that's definitely a great word to use for it. Anybody else have a different feeling or want to?
We're getting a couple on the chat, and we have Jackie wrote, it was powerful and insightful. Terry wrote, loved it, absolutely. I'm not sure what that word was, memorable. Fern Cantor, an eye-opener to American history.
Really was.
Yeah, Earl wrote that it was a great book, great writer. We all need to know about the Dust Bowl and the struggles.
Good.
I felt that it made the book really come to life. I had read about the Dust Bowl, seen movies about the Dust Bowl, but when I read this book, I felt the Dust Bowl, and I thought it was extremely enlightening.
I did too. And you know what else?
I said to somebody has their mic on. Hold on 1 second. I said to people, you could taste the dust.
That's right. You can feel that grit, right?
Yes.
You really could. Her style of writing, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but her style was amazing in terms of bringing it to life. Any other thoughts?
Lynda, it's Kathy.
Yeah.
I really like this book in many ways. I did have some issues with it, which I might talk about later, but I found it a really difficult book to read. I had to kind of put it down at times.
Yeah.
Because it was just so graphic and so painful and so real.
Yeah.
And it was really a fascinating book, and one that I think is totally worthwhile to read.
Right. And you know, do you guys remember when I went to school, we had to read The Grapes of Wrath, which of course is Steinbeck's novel. So that was really the only introduction that I ever had to the Dust Bowl. And what's interesting about this book is we're seeing it through a woman's eyes, a woman's perspective, which I think is what the author wants us to see. And I found it extremely interesting. So Leslie, did you have your hand up? I think I see that on the screen.
Yes, I was going to say that I found it really hard, to read it. It was just, they went through so much, and it was painful, but
right.
I couldn't stop reading. I read it every single day.
Right.
That.
Yeah.
Right.
We also got, somebody said it was engaging, great writing. I listened to the book on Audible, and the characters really come to life. We also have the inequality seems to be systematic, and only wished Elsa would have lived. California was an eye-opener, but still big money. Like Welty kept on doing what they are doing till the day. And let's see, it was a wonderful book which introduced me to an era I know about, that this provided details. The role of women and how they rose to the occasion was powerful.
Right.
And did you get Jillian? Because her hand was up.
Yeah, hi. I had never read about the Dust Bowl and or this whole era, so it was eye-opening, and I did she was very descriptive, a little too descriptive about the dust. I almost did feel like I could taste it as well.
Right.
But I just found it very depressing, especially the end. And
Right.
her whole life was just depressing from beginning, the way her parents, labeled her and treated her,
Right.
till, even her husband, the way he really didn't love her.
Right.
And then at the end, I mean, it was really a very, when people asked me about the book, I said, well, it's not a very happy book, but it's very interesting to learn about.
Right,
So,
exactly. It's compelling, and yet you're right. There's a lot of sadness. And you lead me to my next question, because I want to talk about, since the author makes a point of letting us know that she really wanted Elsa, her background, to impact on her later life. So let's talk about her childhood. How was she perceived in her family? How would you describe her? What do you remember from the story about her childhood? That we're going to talk later about how it impacted her later life. But in the beginning, in those years, in those early years, I'll start us out. Yeah. Judy, did you have something?
She was denied a family life, totally.
Right. Totally.
She felt she was a burden, and they always pushed her aside and shunned her.
That's right. And what else? What else would you say?
You have, Jackie said, like the stepsister in Cinderella.
A lot like that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Rosen said an invalid who had little value to her family. Fern said her sense of isolation from love and inclusion. Diane, and Lynn said very lonely. And
Very
Leslie has her hand up.
Leslie, did you have something to add?
I didn't realize that my hand was still up, but I could say that she just felt that she was like a nobody. She just had no identification,
Right.
and she didn't feel loved. And when she meets Raphael, is that his name?
Yeah.
I was just kind of shocked that she just went with him. So, without even thinking. And I had the feeling she was going to get pregnant. And
Right.
she just was so innocent of information because she had nobody really that supported her.
Picture the fact that it was always accepted that she would be alone. And in fact, at one point, her mother says to her, you know what, you are, they convince her she's so unattractive. The author describes her as nearly 6 feet tall. She was not in her sister's wedding because she was taller than the groom. And the mother says to her, no man wants an unattractive wife who looms over him. So you can imagine growing up with those kind of words. I don't know about you, but I found that scene when she goes to the store and she buys that red silk fabric. I found that so painful. Even the guy that sells her the fabric says, oh yeah, take this home for your sisters. Never dawning on him that it might be beautiful on her. And she goes home. Do you remember that scene? And she makes a little dress out of it, and she holds it against the mirror, and she feels, quote, almost pretty in it. And her mother goes crazy when she sees her in the dress and says, a pretty dress does not make one pretty, dear. You are unmarriageable, Elsinore, even with all our money and standing. And the mother tells her, just be happy with your real life. Throw away your silly romantic novels. So she kind of always reads, she's reading The Age of Innocence, and she's really wishing that she'll have a family of her own. She had dreams of going to college. You remember that? And her father, she says she wants to be a writer, and her father is so sarcastic. He says to her, oh, do you have some hidden talent we don't know about or we're unaware of? And he accuses her of being hysterical, and he sends her upstairs. And of course, they all revert back to this image of her as a sickly child, which she was no longer. So my feeling was it was not surprising that she went with Rafe. She fell for him hook, line, and sinker. Like Leslie says, she was very innocent. And she finally was feeling attractive, and that somebody was attracted to her. So I guess to me, it wasn't that surprising that she fell for him. And of course, how did this impact on her later life? She has this image of herself in childhood. What do we see about her later on in life? How would you describe her before California?
I think Sandy has her hand up. Sandy, do you want to
Yeah,
unmute?
she never felt comfortable with who she
Never.
was.
That's right.
She had this horrible image of herself that wouldn't leave. And when you're brought up that way, it is a very difficult process to get over if indeed you ever do.
Right. She felt insecure for the remainder of her life, right? Till the very, very end. And we see that, unfortunately, with her husband. Do you remember the fact that she just assumed he found her unattractive? So she would never reach out to him. She held herself back from him. Doesn't say she never will initiate any intimacy because she's so afraid of being rejected. She's afraid of saying the wrong thing to him, that he'll leave her, of pushing him away. She's so afraid. It motivates every action that she does with her husband.
Meryl said that she grows stronger and stronger and loves her children so much. She's always working to keep them protected.
So we see that arc in her. You're right. She does. She changes so much throughout the story. Yeah.
Peppy has her hand up.
I think a key point was that the family, her husband, boyfriend, whatever, that husband, parents, they made a huge positive impact.
A huge impact.
I mean, that really was the turning point, I would say, in her development as a more confident person.
We're going to talk about that, Peppy. You're right. That was a huge, important piece of the story, that relationship, for sure.
Lynda, I felt she worked so hard to prove to them that she could do this work. She didn't know how to clean. She didn't know how to cook.
Right.
But I'm willing to learn. And through her hard work, she proved herself and they recognized her. And that was a wonderful thing about this family for her.
Right. She finally had that kind of recognition. The thing I found so painful was the fact that her insecurity affected the relationship with Lareda. Do you remember this part in the story? It affected her relationship because when her daughter started to pull away from her, it brought back to her all of the insecurities that she had. So even her relationship with her daughter was affected. She blamed herself when Rafi pulled away from her. She thought to herself that, there was some flaw that he had seen and her parents had seen, and Lareda had seen, and that's why they all were pulling away from her. And years later, even when she meets Jack, just going ahead for a second, and he's looking at her, and what does she say to him? She says, I'm not going to get any prettier, And he's taken aback. He says, what? You think that's what I'm thinking when I look at you? But again, it's this childhood insecurity. All these messages she had received from years ago, she's feeling it. And years later, her girlfriend, Jean, gives her a compliment. And Elsa says, come on and look at me, Jean. I wasn't pretty in the best of times when I was young and well-fed and clean and wore fine clothes. And Jean says to her, Elsa, you have such a wrong picture of yourself. And Elsa says, yeah, but what does a person do about that? The things your parents say and the things your husband doesn't say become a mirror, don't they? And Jean, being a very dear friend, what does she say? I love that line. You remember the line? She says, break that mirror. She says, I'm a mirror too. And she sees Elsa as she really is. Loving, warm, and beautiful. Yeah.
Lynda, one thing that really impacted me was that ultimately, I think that Elsa believed in herself and her strength and really came to love herself. And she met Jack. I think that's why she met Jack, because she realized there was a purpose in her life. And that's often the way it is, when we really think about ourselves and what we want and what's important to us and that we're important, many times the universe responds to that. And it did in this story, I think.
When she was able to see her own strength, she was able to appreciate what he was actually offering her. Yeah, that's such a good point.
Jackie also pointed out, Lynda, in the chat, she was just saying that you are a product of your upbringing, but what she couldn't understand was that how Elsa's parents didn't treat all the kids the same, that there was such a disparity between,
Right.
kids in that house. And that did really obviously affect the rest of her life.
Right. You're right, Jackie, it is interesting, but it made me almost think of the Cinderella story, in some cases where one child is, and listen, she was 6 feet tall. And in those days, people were even shorter, perhaps, right? I guess, I don't know. And the others were perhaps they were prettier. But the point is, instead of accenting her strengths and emphasizing what was beautiful about their daughter, they went ahead and did the opposite. So yeah, who can ever explain those kinds of things? And Rafi too, by the way, was affected by his childhood. And I love one line in there. First of all, so how was Rafi? How was he impacted by his childhood? Well, for one thing, Rose had had other children, do you remember, before he was born, and they died, infants that died, and she had a little cemetery in the backyard of all of her past children. And they had great expectations for him, right? He'd be the first Martinelli to go to college. And of course, Rafi never bought into any of that. He didn't like book learning. He didn't even want to go. But I love one line that Rose says to Elsa later on. She says, "What damage I did to Raffaello by loving him too much," because remember how she spoiled him? "I fear your parents did to you by loving you too little." Doesn't that just sum up a lot of how they were both impacted by their childhood? So let's talk about Rafi. Was he at all a sympathetic character? I mean, what do you think about Rafi? Well, what do you want to say about him?
One comment that came in from Meryl was that he wanted to get away. And she said an
to get
example
away.
like John Boy, which I think is interesting. That brings back stuff, right? But anyway,
Right.
That's true.
Sure, she was sort of forced upon him. All of a sudden she's pregnant and he's got this wife. He's a kid he was 18 years old. He was not looking for this. So yeah, this happened to him. What else? What about their relationship? And anything else you want to say? What I took away, yeah, go ahead.
Kathy just said he did his duty, though his heart wasn't in it. And yeah, that is true.
He didn't understand at all the fact that she, interestingly enough, took on the love of the land that his parents had. He did not have any of it. And he did not understand what she felt was this sense of belonging, because he never had the experience of not belonging. So as she was getting closer and closer to his parents, what was he doing? He was veering further and further away.
Lynda,
Sorry.
Yeah.
Jillian
He
and
was-
Leslie have their hands up. So
Go ahead,
Jillian-
sure.
He was a dreamer, and he filled his daughter with dreams and things.
That's right.
And then, he didn't really like working the land, and Elsa really embraced it and took it over. He was just more like, I want to get out of here.
I want to get
Go
out
to
of
New
here.
York or California, whatever. But
Right.
they never followed up, did they, with him in the end? Like, I kept thinking she was going to run into him or whatever, or the daughter. I don't know. I kept thinking we would see him again, but we
Jillian,
never did.
it's so interesting you would say that, because in one of the podcasts that I watched, people said to her, "Didn't you want to put in a thing where she comes up, she sees him when she's successful, or they get to," she says, no, she didn't, because often in life that doesn't really happen. But the one who will have that opportunity, perhaps, is Lareda years later. Lareda might have that opportunity to have a comeuppance with him. But yeah, no, we don't really know what happens to him. We do know that he was drinking, right? We do know that there was one line in there that was great about that the drought had dried him up as much as the land. In other words, he was a weak character. He couldn't handle what was in front of him.
You got a comment from Jackie that said that it would have been too Hollywoodish, which I was thinking the same thing. I was glad that that didn't happen, because it would have been too and it also would have taken away from that whole watching Elsa gain strength on her own. Like, that would have taken her to a place she didn't need to go.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, good. So this story is a lot about relationships. We know that. And I think one of the interesting relationships was between Lareda and her mother. And we're going to talk about the fact of Lareda being a teenager, but I want to focus on the relationship that she had with her mother. We know that that relationship was that we're talking about before California first. She had a very close relationship until she was 12. And then when she was 12, what happened? What happened when she turned 12 all of a sudden? The closeness is with her father.
Yeah.
She draws away from her mother. Why was that? Why do you think she pulled away from her mother?
She's a teenager.
She's a teenager, man. That says it all. Yeah.
But
What else?
I think she blamed her mother for her
She
father.
blames her mother. Right. I think so too. She blames her mother for everything. Right.
Yeah.
She blames her mother that the father left. What else? What else? She hated the fact that her mother was so practical. She hated that her mother was the one that was always working, never laughing. Her mother was always harping about saving food, not wasting water, not dirtying their clothes. You know, and what was the father? What was he doing at the same time the mother was doing all of this practical stuff?
He was a dreamer.
He was filling her head with dreams. Absolutely. And she wanted to be much more like her father. And again, she blames mother for being the source of father's unhappiness. And it's so interesting. In one of the interviews with the author, she says she really wanted this relationship between Lareda and her mother to be a conflicted, almost contemptuous one. Why? And I thought this was great. She said, when you're writing a novel, you need to have obviously some conflict. Now, who was going to be an adversary with Elsa when things were so bad for Elsa? I mean, who's going to pick on Elsa when she's fighting the drought and she's fighting a flood and she's trying to fight for survival? The only person who could be an adversary would be who?
Her daughter.
A teenage daughter. Absolutely. So that's why I thought it was really interesting that she wanted this, because it really is a really real conflict that could have happened. So let's talk about how Lareda was presented as a real teenager. I think she did a very good job of depicting her. Besides the relationship with her mother, which of course was very conflicted, what else? Well, the fact that as teenager, she was filled with dreams. She preferred her father's fun rather than the mother's seriousness. How about the fact that she was so influenced by her friends and actually jealous of her friend? Remember Stella? Jealous that the banker's daughter had new dresses, jealous of the fact that Stella's family finally left. And when Stella's family left, that was like a devastating blow, if you recall. She was really a very typical teenager. But the piece I thought that was very important, and this, of course, is a pivotal piece in the story, just to refresh your memory. Jean, mother, Elsa's friend in the ditch camp, right? Jean's baby dies. And what happens? Lareda is so angry with God and her mother that they are in this position. And so what does Lareda do as a teenager? Instead of just appreciating the devastating loss and the sadness, she lashes out at her mother. And she says, if Daddy were here, he would never let us live like this, burying dead babies in the dark, working our fingers to the bone, standing in line for 2 hours to get a can of milk from the government, and watching everyone around us get sick. She knows she's hurting her mother, but that doesn't stop her. So
there was a couple comments. Meryl had said that teens go through so many changes. And I just wanted to say one thing about that I did think also, which I'm sure you read too, was that Kristen Hanna, was writing this during this pandemic time, right. And having a teenage girl myself, it was definitely hard for them. And so, so I'm saying the Dust Bowl, all of that stuff going on around her, only exacerbates what is already going on in their bodies. So
that's such a good point, Debbie, because she talks about that, how the pandemic, in much the same way, was, out of our control. the way this drought was out of everyone's control. And so what happens, these teenagers, the conflict becomes in the family. You know, they don't get the fact that everybody is suffering as a result. And they feel their own pain at that point and lash out very often. Yeah. Yeah.
Also,
And
Leslie has her hand up. So Leslie, do you wanna-
Leslie?
Yeah, I was going to say that, of course, the main character, Elsa, goes through a major change, and that is what the book focuses on. But I think the change in Lareda's personality and how she recognizes what she was before and how sorry she is. I mean, that's amazing that she, you know, comes to that conclusion and lets it be known that she recognizes it. Yeah.
I thank you, Leslie. I think that's such a good point. The fact that the author really shows this great arc of change in both Elsa, but also Lareda. Yeah, absolutely.
And Meryl echoed that because she said Lareda grew up early, which is true. She really
had, that's right. She really did. The other thing I love about this typical teenage bit, when she finally runs away and Jack Valance picks her up in his truck and he says, I got one stop to make, stay in the truck. Don't come out. So what does she do?
She doesn't.
She doesn't listen to him, right? She gets out of the truck and she goes into the Workers' Alliance meeting and she listens to his fiery words. And she's a kid. She's just, you know, in youth, there's such enthusiasm for change. She takes to it and she sees her place in this struggle. But getting back to the change in her that you guys brought out, at that point, listening to Jack, all of a sudden we see one very interesting change. No longer does she see her father as the ideal. All of a sudden she realizes Jack is really a rebel and he's a man of action, not like her faithless father. And she realizes she wants to emulate more like Jack, wants to be more like Jack than like her father. Also, I love the fact that she goes to the library and gets books that she knows her mother would be crazed if she knew that she was taking out books about communism and socialism. And of course, she gets kicked out of her American history class when she wants to talk about the rights of farm workers. I mean, this is very teenager-ish, instead of learning about, you know, old rich men that died 100 years prior. I want to get back to something that you guys brought up, the relationship with Tony and Rose, because I think that's a very important relationship, as you guys saw in the story. So it starts out, as we mentioned, where she's pregnant, disowned. There she is on their doorstep. Rose goes crazy. What about all of the dreams we had for Rafi? He was going to be the first one to go to college. Elsa has to make a decision at that time. She's just going to live invisible with them. And invisibility was a skill she had learned in her own family. But as we said, she converts to Catholicism. And what I loved about the kind of work that she did and how she was appreciated within that family is when the baby is born. And what does Rose say when the baby is born? She's finally begun to appreciate Elsa, and she says to the baby, welcome to the family. And Elsa realizes she is saying it to her as well as to the baby, Lareda. And of course, Rose ultimately says at the end, you know, before she leaves for California, she says to Elsa, number one, that she considers her the daughter she never had. But most of all, what I loved was, here's a quote: "You are more capable of love and commitment than anyone I have ever known. You were the best thing that ever happened to my son. He was a fool to have missed that." So again, you see this beautiful arc of change in the relationship with Tony and Rose. So were you surprised that they didn't go to California? Yeah. Why or why not?
I wasn't so surprised.
What?
At first I was, but then on reflection, I wasn't, because they were like so many that you mentioned in the introduction.
Right.
The land was foremost to them, and the government was going to help them, and they simply couldn't bear the thought of leaving their home. It was all they knew.
Right, right.
And they felt some hope. They really felt some hope.
They did have a lot of hope. They felt that connection to the land. What else?
Meryl said they love their land and older people hate change, and who knew if it was better, and it was their land, which I agree with you, Kathy. I felt, I was shocked at first, like I didn't see that coming, they weren't going, but of course it made sense once, you know, they weren't going, but it was kind of, I think it was more of a like, what? Like you just didn't, it just, they were all preparing together, but we didn't really see that they were preparing them.
Right.
More than themselves. So
I think if the government subsidy or wherever had not existed, they might have been forced to make another different decision just to survive. But they could survive on, you know, at least get enough to eat or whatever, you know what I mean, because of the government. And that was very strategically important in the country, you know, those kinds of things that were happening at that time.
Lynda, too, Fern pointed out that they were the roots of the land.
Yeah, yeah.
So that was,
you know, Beth, to follow up on that thought, Fern's thought, it says they're like a plant that can grow in only one place. One of the kids says that. And I love this part too, why they couldn't leave their land. It says, quote, they might have come off the boat as Anthony and Rosalba, but hard work and the land had turned them into Tony and Rose, Americans. They would die of thirst and hunger before they'd give that up. So it was all part of their American dream. They just were not willing to give it up. Yeah, and I agree. I also was surprised that they didn't go, and then upon reflection realized, of course, that it shouldn't have been surprising.
And it probably would have been harder had they gone. That was the one thing I thought when you saw how they were living, how difficult that would have been for
right,
Rose and
exactly,
Tony.
Right. And, you know, I love also another line from the story when they talk about the land, the connection to the land. Tony, remember, he's showing, Tony accepts Elsa in the very beginning, a lot before Rose does. And he takes her for a tour of the farm and he says to her, quote, my land tells its story if you listen, the story of our family. We plant, we tend, we harvest. I make wine from grape outings that I brought here from Sicily, and the wine that I make reminds me of my father. It binds us one to another as it has for generations, and now it will bind you to us. So what you see with these farmers is not only this connection to the land, but you see this connection to the people, the family, and that the land, it's they're inextricably bound to one another. The land, the family, and of course, the farmer.
And Lynda, Meryl had pointed out, which this really goes with what you're saying, it was about the letters that they wrote to each other, which talked about that binding of each other, and that even though they cloaked the truth, they kept each other going through those letters, and on both ends of those letters.
That's right. They both kept each other going with that positivity. Exactly. And Rose always signed her letters with, you know, hard times don't last, love does. So it was totally important for them. The author also says, by the way, in one of her interviews, that motherhood was a major theme of this story. How so? How does she depict motherhood? Talk about Elsa as a mother. What other characters does she depict motherhood as part of her theme? Any thoughts? Well, let's face it. Why did she?
Sorry. You got Elsa, Jean, Rose, all very strong.
Very strong mothers, exactly.
Yeah.
And what you see with Elsa, why does she even embark on this treacherous journey in a broken down truck with very little gas money and very little money at all, just by herself with her two children? Why does she even take this journey to California?
Because she feels it will be a better life for her children. I think
that
she lives for
and
her
else.
children.
Do you remember
Marilyn? Wasn't it because of the health of her?
Right.
Otherwise, she had the choice to go before. And I really think the only reason was a healthy reason more than financial or anything else.
Yes, she could have gone with Rafi, but she thought in a practical way, their life would, she was worried about the food lines in the cities. She was worried about that trip to California. You're right. And so the one thing that really motivates her now is the fact that he has dust pneumonia. By the way, who even knew about that?
Yes.
But that was something of the time that was a real big killer of people that ingested that dust. And that's what causes her to embark on the journey. Any other thoughts as far as motherhood?
Yeah, Sandy had pointed out, I think that in not just motherhood, but the unconditional love of motherhood.
Right, right. Any other thoughts? So I loved, there's a line in there that nothing can break your heart like motherhood. Lareda, as an Elsa grieved daily for the loss of closeness with her firstborn. At first, she tried to scale the walls of her daughter's adolescent irrational anger. She volleyed back and forth with words of love, but Loreda's continuing, thriving impatience with Elsa had done worse than grind her down. It had resurrected all the insecurities of her childhood. So this motherhood thing is really, it was very, very painful for her. To be a mother was a very painful thing for her. And of course, I was so moved by Jean. Jean's very last words before she died was to her children. Do you remember that? She says, I had so much more that I wanted to tell you, so much more that I wanted to talk to you about. So you see this very strong bond of motherhood. Just talking about style, the author, what were some of the scenes that stick with you that she, in terms of the stylistic writing, how she did it, how did she describe certain scenes? Do they stick with you? There are several scenes that really stick with me about the dust storms, about the poverty, about the way the immigrants were treated.
One thing I just wanted to mention was Black Sunday.
Yes.
And that's a fact that did happen. And I learned through my sister that my mother, who was a teenager and was born and raised in Nebraska,
yes,
vividly remembered that day, that Sunday, and described it in great detail. And
right.
It was just a shock to see how black the sky was.
Right. And you know what's really, it's so interesting that the point that she makes in there, that so much topsoil, I forget what she said, it was crazy how many tons of topsoil ended up in Washington, D.C. That's how fierce that wind was, that carried that tremendous amount of topsoil, black soil that had no grasses holding it down, of course.
Her writing was so amazing through that, because you really were under the table with them and just could not, I mean, it was amazing. And I, for one, had no idea of like, that's how people live through that. And just that fear and the coming out from underneath that table and seeing their house and the fire.
The idea of the gas mask, the Vaseline in their noses, trying to block everything covered with dirt. There were, and the centipedes coming out of the walls, right? I mean, it was just unbelievable. The way that she describes, you really do feel that dust. And the way she describes the poverty, right? How about the idea that she goes ahead and has to take cardboard and cut out the insoles to put into Loreda's shoes when the bottoms are worn out? The kind of poverty that was a soul-crushing thing, the way she describes it. Any other scenes that stick with you?
Well, even when they had that flood, the flood in California, when the water came up from the river.
And everything washed away, yeah. The irony of going from a drought to a flood that carries away all of your belongings. But how about the whole idea of the painful experience? Didn't you just feel your fingers prickled when they're picking the cotton? The idea that kids have to pick the cotton as opposed to going to school. How about even those scenes of having to go to the hospital and beg for assistance and be turned away? There were so many very painful scenes in the story that the author describes. And of course, what kept them going during their time in the ditch camp? So we talked about the letters from Rose and Tony. Anything else that kept them going? One of the things that the author really emphasizes is the friendship she has with Jean. And she talks in her interviews about the importance of friendships, of female relationships, how we can count on friends. And of course, in this case, if you remember, the friendship with Jean was very, very deep, and it really sustained her. It was very moving in the very beginning, the very first scene when Jean approaches them when they first come and they sort of think they're only going to be at that ditch camp one night. And Jean comes, and what does she give them as a welcoming gift? Do you remember? A single red potato. It's all she has. But she welcomes them with this potato. What else about that friendship struck you? It struck me the fact that Elsa had nothing. And yet, as soon as she would get money from the government, because she was registered, what did she do with that? She went right back to the ditch camp, right? And she gave money to Jean and sustained Jean with what extra food she had. And of course, what we do find that it was Jean's death that becomes the turning point. Elsa realizes it is enough. Because at that point, if you remember, she couldn't get Jean into a hospital, right? She has to threaten with a baseball bat to get aspirin. At that point, she realizes, you know what? Maybe Jack and his Workers' Alliance is the way to go. So Jean's death becomes a turning point. Were you aware of the level of discrimination at that time? Let's talk a little bit about that. When they get to California, what kind of discrimination do they run into?
Well, they were Okies.
They were Okies. No matter where you were from, you were an Okie.
Yep.
It didn't matter if you were from Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, Nebraska, right?
Yeah.
How about these, they all say, don't, how about this scene when in the school, they send Lareda to the school and Lareda walks into the classroom and one of the boys holds his nose and they're all laughing when she's eating her potato. And when Anthony gets into a fight with another kid and the principal scolds the other kid, why? Hey, you're not supposed to touch him. You're not supposed to go near him. They carry diseases. That's why he scolds the kid. The kind of discrimination where they say, it's all the same, whether you're from Texas, Oklahoma, Alabama, you're all the same. Your kind doesn't live here. Anything else about the discrimination? Very, very powerful at that time.
I think we have a lot of that at our time. I mean, honestly, that I thought what we see now, and I don't get too political, but the point is the discrimination, the anti-immigrant thing. I mean, it's a part of our history, frankly.
Yeah. And again, this is one of the parallels that the author sees at this time. Yeah, exactly. What did you think about the relationship with Jack and Elsa? Did you like that romantic piece? What did you think about it? And what drew them together in the first place? Well, I think for starters, he sees how much she loves her children. He sees how strong she is. What else? Any other thoughts on that? Well, did you like the fact that they end up together? Not end up together, but their relationship develops? Leslie, did you have something?
Okay. I thought it was interesting how she converted to his way of thinking because she was so against it and didn't want the daughter to have anything to do with him, and how he really influenced her.
Right. He was able to influence first Lareda, right? And then ultimately her. And again, what caused that change in her? What do you think caused that change?
Jackie has her hand up. Jackie, you want to look?
I wasn't actually going to say that about what caused the change, but I liked the relationship and I felt like it was a kind of a breath of fresh air I loved the book, but I thought the entire book was unbelievably difficult to get through. And I thought their relationship kind of gave you that little breath of fresh air, like there still was hope. So I liked it.
Yeah.
We also got, though, for Meryl, that Jack and Elsa was not necessary, but it was a nice touch. And Kathy said that I love that they were together at last and that she could accept his love, which I think is what you're getting at. It's about she was able to accept love. So I think that was to your point.
That way, and right, Kat, going back to Kathy's point, that was when she was really ready She was recognizing her own strength, and she was able to understand his views and to move forward. And of course, Jean's death really devastated her. She realized, oh my God, we are out here dying. We're sick, we're dying. And what is going to be done? We've got to stand up for what's right. And she ultimately makes the decision. I think it was a confluence of events, Jean's death, and of course, the fact that Jack is there. And she realizes in Jack, she sees a lot of wonderful traits in him, but most of all, that he saved her children. So she sees that. So she's very much drawn to him. Although, again, that insecurity in her, she can't understand what he sees in her. Right. And he, in fact, appreciates her bravery. He desires her as a woman, and he calls her a warrior, right? She is a warrior. Exactly.
Sandy does point out that it was cumulative and that Elsa saw so much unfairness that she was finally ready to see another way.
Right, right. And I want to, just before I'm watching the time here, but I do want to go on and talk a little bit about the communism piece in here. So it's interesting. In the beginning, Lareda and Elsa sees it differently. How does Lareda see it? How does Elsa see it?
Leslie has her hand up.
No. I had my hand up about the relationship with Jack, and I just wanted to say that she always had dreams about what a good relationship should be with a man, even dreams about how it should be sexually. Right. And it was finally fulfilled with Jack. And that I thought was great, like a great thing to happen to her before she died.
Right. But also the fact, what you also see is that she's able to give of herself too. Going back to Kathy's point, at that point, she's at a point where she can do that. Yeah. Right. I think what's interesting about Lareda and Elsa with communism, it reminded me sort of the way, the youth movement against Vietnam, and most youth movements, most protest movements are very often driven by the young, aren't they? And so we see where Lareda was very drawn to communism in the beginning, the whole idea of equality. And Lareda and Elsa is very practical. She's worried, hey, you're protesting against the guy who feeds us, gives us our money, our employer. So she's very nervous to do that, whereas Loreda's ready to jump in. Did someone else have something they wanted to say? Because
Cynthia has her hand up.
Not about communism.
Go ahead, whatever.
I was waiting for Leslie to say something. The author, from the very beginning, showed her research and empathy for the land, but also the animals. Yes. All the animals, the cow, milking the cow, the chickens, and the bravery of Lareda. You didn't discuss that. The bravery of her when she saw the horse.
Yes.
So much pain. Could we do that?
You're right.
That showed me that she was a real person maturing.
Yes, she really was. She really felt this unbelievable empathy for this animal. And you get that all throughout the idea of these farm animals were so dear to them. Mm-hmm. And certainly that horse was more than just a farm animal that had become so close with Lareda. Yeah, unbelievable bravery and quite a bit of feeling that Lareda had when she was able to do that. Thank you, Cynthia. Such a good point. Okay, any other thoughts on the way they saw the communism piece? You should know that the author was very surprised because she got a lot of, I don't want to say a lot, but she got a fair amount of negative comments about communism. Some readers felt that she was idealizing communism. Do you see any point in that? Do you see where readers would think that? I found that surprising. She did too. Yeah.
I mean, I think at those times, look, people were desperate. They were looking for answers. And it had been, 30 years roughly since the revolution in Russia.
Right.
People were grasping for in many people's eyes, our system was not working and they were looking for answers. And people do that. It's human nature. Right. Especially young people, because they have more of a future.
Marion also has her hand up. Marion, you want to unmute?
Yeah, what I wanted to say too, I was very disappointed, I guess, with FDR's program, which I always thought was for the people. And it seemed to me that in this situation, why communism or the talk of communism was so strong is because it was still supporting those people who were putting these poor people down. And so that was my take from it.
Right. They were, you're right, that the FDR was taking care of the people in the cities at that time, and
Right.
and not with the Dust Bowl people. Exactly. So communism, the whole idea of unionism was really what that was a very important piece of history at that time, which is where unions were actually beginning. And so the author tells us she was simply reporting history. She was talking about history. And so she thought people were very misguided to think that she was in any way extolling the benefits of communism.
Cynthia has her hand up as well. Cynthia,
just briefly, I remember Tennessee Ernie Ford saying, and you owe your soul to the country store.
Yes.
Wow,
Yes.
did I learn a lot about the real country store.
You know what, that brings me, Cynthia, to one of my last questions is what did we really learn in this? And I know we learned a lot of history. By the way, FDR in the end, the answer was to let the land rest. It was right to pay the farmers. And in a way, he did in the end come through, although it took so many years of hardship and deprivation and everything else for that to happen. But I think we really learned a lot about that time period. And I know I'm watching the time here, so I just want to end well, but I want to ask you, at the end, the fact that Lareda becomes the narrator, I thought that was such an interesting thing. What happens with Lareda at the end? Are you surprised? I mean, it was so important for her to get her mother home. Why was it so important to get her mother home at the end? And by the way, what did you think of the ending?
I had some problems with the ending. I felt that it just wasn't necessary to make her such a martyr. I felt there was so much more of her story to tell. And maybe this discussion can help me understand why the author felt she had to die and why Jack had to die. And there were other loose ends, like what happened to the Welties? What happened to all these horrible, horrible people who took advantage of all of these poverty-stricken folks? And there just wasn't closure for me. I felt, honestly, one part of me just felt like Kristen Hanna had to quickly wrap this up and get it done with. And that bothered me.
Okay, so that's interesting. So I know the ending was very devastating. And it's funny because in a few of these interviews where she talks to readers, a lot of the readers say she does a lot of this, they call it an ugly cry. Why does she make people cry in her books? You know, her point is she doesn't want it to be a Hollywood ending. It is these were real stories in many cases. And I guess what she wants to do, what do you guys think about the ending? I was quite devastated by the end as well. But I actually thought maybe she's really trying to portray that so many of these people did not have happy endings. And she really was trying to really reflect fairly accurately the horror of the times that people had to live through.
I also did think it was interesting how she brought the childhood illness had damaged her heart, like all of that they had said, and that was part of her demise at the end, that she wasn't strong enough to.
Yeah, that's a very good irony at the end. It does ultimately, because she might have survived the shot. We don't know the shooting, except for the fact that she had underlying medical issue, right?
Yeah.
It was so interesting, the ending, when Lareda is so desperate to get her mother home. Do you remember what she does? She actually disguises herself, holds up the country store that had imprisoned them all that time. And she holds up the store, she robs them, and she takes the money, and she uses that money with Jack, of course, at the end. And Jack is able to take them back. So what do we see at the very end in that last scene? She holds up the store, gets her mother home. What are we seeing there in Lareda?
Her mother's.
What do we see in her?
I think she sees real love. The feeling that the true love that she really felt for her mother.
She felt that love for her mother, exactly, and her grief at what she had put her mother through, the realization of that she did not appreciate her mother when she was young. And so she feels this mix of emotions, and also that unbelievable connection to the land that her mother had, right? And she wants her mother to, quote, go home again. And also to her and aunt, they go home to the land. Of course, ultimately at the very end, we see the ending, we see where in the epilogue, we see that she does end up going to college back in California. And it leaves us, Kathy, as you say, we don't really know what happened to Welty and the rest of them, but we do know that the book does end with a great sense of hope, with Lareda, who's now going to go on to her future. And she's a girl who has learned a lot from her mother. She has a lot of that same grit, and we can expect good things from her, right? And so I think the book ends with a sense of hope, and that Anthony is back on the farm, perhaps to continue that lineage on the farm. But I think we do have a sense of hope at the end of the book. Anything we've left out? Any other endings any other things that before we end, anyone wants to bring out? I am being very mindful of the time.
I just wanted to say that the robbery just now reminded me of Thelma and Louise.
At the end, desperation. That's right.
Yeah. And Lareda was very strong, very strong.
Very strong.
Well, the robbery, I just went back to read, because I read this a while ago, but I looked at the ending and about how she did hold up the store. And then when at the end she goes and then she's happy to be a woman by the laundry lines to hide the gun, grab the money, like she was almost proud to be a woman then. But she did learn from her mom about the whole hospital scene for Jean.
Yeah.
You know, like how you have to be strong and you know, stand up for what's
That's
important
right.
to you.
Right.
And she did appreciate her mother. And it was sad that she, you know, it only took like that, you know, when her mom was dying to really appreciate
to really
her
see
mom.
that. And of course, we see Elsa when she stands up. At that point, she realizes she's risking her children more by not standing up. She needs to teach them to stand up for what's right. And therefore, she does stand up on the truck. And of course, she encourages everybody to, during the sit down. Yeah.
Marian has her hand up. Marian, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, I don't know if this is exactly appropriate, but I just can't get off without saying it. This book, in a way, reminded me of American Dirt, in the way we really got into the hearts and souls of the people who lived it. And I just read a book called Into the Forest, which is written as a novel, but it's factual. And it's a Holocaust book, but it's a very different kind of Holocaust book. And it brings you into the forest. So for anybody who's interested, it's by Roberta Frankel. And I think that this group would really enjoy it.
Thank you, Marian. We'll definitely jot that down as one of our possible selections. That sounds really good. So just to wind us up here, I think what's interesting is that the author really does want us to reflect upon the fact that what we're living through now with the pandemic and the economic downturn and the questions about immigration and the discrimination that we're experiencing and the ecological concerns that we have with climate change and all of these other things, there are many, many parallels to the story of the Dust Bowl and what went on in the 1930s. I hope you enjoyed our conversation today. I think time-wise, are we up? Debbie's been very patient, I think, here, right?
No, we are good. We are good. Yeah.
And
I just wanted to again thank you, Lynda, for leading this discussion, and thank the Friends of the Sterling Road Library, who we love to partner with on these programs. And we are just thrilled so many people joined us today, and we hope that they will join us again on November 16th to do the discussion about Transcendent Kingdom by Gyasi. There were a couple of emails that came through. People had tried to register and there was an issue, but we fixed it while we were online. So I encourage you to go to dpjcc.org and go ahead and register for that next program. That book is, just to tell you, much shorter. So no excuses not to read, but definitely enjoy the next book. And Lynda, as always, thank you for a wonderful afternoon.
And thank you all for your participation. I think it adds so much to our enjoyment of reading when we can talk about these books
Yes,
and enjoy each other's perspective. Thank you all.
Thank you. It's so nice
Thanks,
to see
Lynda.
everybody.
Thank
Mm.
you.
Thank you.
See you all next month. We'll look forward to that.
Thank you, Lynda.
Thank you. So glad to see everyone.
Thanks so much, Lynda.
A pleasure. Thank you for all your participation.